At least 3,000 people were killed here. As the site is now open to the public, we are seeing perhaps the most notorious wartime crimes in human history.
A covert germ warfare unit that tortured prisoners in the name of science.
For 80 years, it sat sealed and untouched. Officials dismissed it as a rumor, but locals insisted something dangerous had been locked away. Generations grew up hearing stories of a hidden chamber, but no one could prove it. When the vault was finally forced open, there were no treasures or relics of victory. What lay inside was worse than gold or weapons.
They were injected with bubonic plague, cholera, bombarded with intense radiation, amputations to study blood loss, and other horrific experiments.
It was evidence of crimes so disturbing that they had been buried out of sight and out of memory, never meant to be uncovered by anyone alive today. The sealed door that shouldn't exist. For decades, villagers in a quiet hillside settlement told stories about something unusual buried deep in the earth. They called it an iron wall, and the story was passed down almost like a ghost tale. According to older residents, Japanese soldiers stationed there during the war had warned locals to stay away from the slope. Farmers recalled being threatened if they worked too close to the area. Others said they remembered hearing muffled explosions toward the end of the war, as if something was being buried or sealed shut. Younger generations often dismissed these accounts as exaggerations. They assumed the stories were simply older people repeating wartime fears. When the site was finally examined, what investigators found was far more horrifying than anyone expected. The structure was not a simple barrier. It was a vault, and it had been locked away with extreme care. It was sealed 3 times over, a welded steel door, reinforced with inner cross braces, and seams that had been carefully packed with clay to keep out water and moisture. This was not the kind of construction made in panic. It looked deliberate and carefully planned. What made it even stranger was the context. In the final months of the war, Japan was desperately short of resources. Steel was being stripped from factories, train lines, and even homes to build weapons. Yet here, instead of being melted into guns or planes, tons of precious steel had been buried underground where no one could use it. Why would a starving nation invest so much in hiding a door unless whatever lay inside mattered more than survival? Some observers even suggested that the door itself looked too modern to have been built in the 1940s, although this claim remains disputed. When the vault was finally cut open, the discovery felt unsettling. As torches burned through the steel, stale air burst out. Witnesses said it smelled metallic, but there was something else in the odor that made people uneasy, almost chemical. Some stepped back instinctively. Others claimed the structure groaned as if the ground resisted being opened. Historians later speculated that Japan often built secret facilities in remote hills to avoid detection from Allied planes. Some believe this could have been linked to hidden research or storage tied to wartime projects. Skeptics point out that there is no official record of such a site in declassified archives. They argue villagers may have confused memories of explosions and military warnings. If so much effort was made to bury and seal a single door, the question remains: what exactly was considered so dangerous or valuable that it had to stay hidden for nearly 80 years? The final days of the empire, a nation hiding its sins. August 1945, as World War II came to its horrifying end, was not just the fall of an empire, but the beginning of a scramble to erase what had been done. As Japanese forces withdrew across Asia.
However, Japanese dreams of empire would not last. To roam across Asia uncontested, Japan had attacked American and European territories.
The retreat came with a pattern of destruction that looked less like defeat and more like a planned purge. Documents vanished, witnesses disappeared, and whole facilities were wiped out before Allied troops could reach them. The moves were quick, methodical, and often violent. This created a patchwork of silence that would haunt investigators for decades. In Tokyo, the destruction took a bureaucratic and physical form. Police stations, ministries, and government offices fed mountains of paperwork into shredders and furnaces. Eyewitnesses later reported hallways littered with ash and paper fragments. Officials working through the night said the machines overheated, and in at least one case burst into flames under overload. The air in parts of the city carried the smell of burned paper and ink for weeks. Some historians say the scale of this paper destruction suggests that key files documenting war crimes were deliberately erased, and that the full record may never be reconstructed. Others caution that dramatic descriptions grew in the retelling and that some post-war accounts may have exaggerated the chaos. Outside the capital, the purge had a more brutal human face. In Seoul and other occupied cities, there are reports that hundreds of prisoners were killed in a short span as surrender neared. According to some accounts, these executions were meant to remove people who could testify about forced labor, abuses, and human experiments. The graves of many are unmarked, and their names are lost. Survivors who later tried to tell what happened often met disbelief, dismissal, or accusations of political motive. That denial added to a sense of injustice and anger among witnesses and families. In Manchuria, where biological and medical programs operated, the erasure was sometimes literal. Local residents reported hearing explosions and finding once populated compounds reduced to scorched earth. Several accounts say buildings were blown up while patients or detained people remained inside. These memories have been consistent in many testimonies, yet skeptics point out that few physical ruins remain to confirm every detail. Some researchers warn that oral history must be weighed carefully against the lack of surviving structures. Some evidence could not be destroyed without losing its value, so those in charge may have chosen another solution. Researchers believe that underground vaults and sealed chambers were built to conceal data, specimens, and technology. Many now suspect this site served that very purpose. Rather than being meant for destruction, the vault may have been designed to preserve materials for later use. Yet, if that was the plan, why has so little surfaced in the decades since? Were most of the rumored sites ever real, or are many simply legends? Lacking clear answers, investigators began studying the design itself, hoping the architecture would explain the purpose. The architecture of Paranoia. This was not just a bunker hidden in a hillside. It was a tomb engineered to survive not only the war, but also the passing of time. From the first look inside, investigators saw this was no hurried shelter. It had been planned and built with precision, as if its builders intended the contents to remain safe for decades, perhaps longer. The first striking feature was the set of airtight inner chambers. These were not ordinary walls. They had been sealed in ways that suggested containment. Some engineers argued the chambers were meant to block the escape of gases or pathogens. Others believed they were designed to prevent outside contamination. Either explanation was unsettling, for such precautions implied the storage of something extremely dangerous. Drainage channels reinforced this impression. Cut at precise angles, they prevented groundwater from entering the vault. In ordinary bunkers, flooding was common and ignored. Here, it had been planned against in advance, as though the builders intended to keep papers, chemicals, or even biological material perfectly dry. The flooring deepened the mystery. It was made of reinforced slabs identical to those in Japanese bank vaults before the war, designed to resist earthquakes and direct bombing. To place such protection in a hidden rural structure raised disturbing questions. Why safeguard a site never meant to be attacked or even found? The vault's layout also drew comparisons to European structures. Some researchers noted similarities to German bunkers for secret weapons projects, suggesting Japan borrowed elements of German design during the wartime alliance. Critics, however, argued the similarities could be coincidence, the result of shared practical needs. Without proof, the claim of German influence remains speculation. Inside, the vault was stifling and unnerving. Concrete walls held in the cold, the silence broken only by dripping water. Rust and mold filled the air, and some investigators reported a faint chemical odor that made them uneasy. The cost of construction was hard to ignore. In the final years of the war, Japan starved for resources, yet this site consumed massive amounts of steel, concrete, and labor. For later observers, this revealed a grim truth. Protecting what lay hidden mattered more than feeding civilians or supplying soldiers. What exactly was placed inside that required so much secrecy and such determined engineering? Weapons that were never meant to be found. Inside the vault, rows of rotted wooden crates looked ordinary until the lids were pried open. What investigators uncovered was terrifying. The first items to draw attention were porcelain casings shaped like grenades. At first, they looked fragile and harmless, but the reports revealed their true purpose. Each one had been packed with fleas carrying plague, designed to release disease the moment they shattered. Several investigators stepped back in shock.
If they'd still be able to recognize themselves after the weeks of malnutrition, disease, violence, and fear.
One muttered in disbelief while another shook his head, refusing to touch the shells. The idea that these could have been dropped into rivers or drinking wells left many pale and visibly unsettled. Other crates held rusted metal canisters marked with faded Japanese script. The smell of rot and metal filled the air as the boxes were opened. Archivists later matched the markings to old catalogs of chemical agents. Tests showed traces of degraded toxins. Though no longer active, the evidence confirmed the canisters had once stored poisons. A few members of the team covered their mouths in disgust. One scientist cursed under his breath, angered by the thought that these had been meant to kill silently and without warning. The team's fear deepened when they uncovered crude flamethrower prototypes. At first, the devices seemed clumsy, but the engineers quickly noticed the strange valves and nozzles. These were not built to project fire. They looked designed to spray liquid into the air. The realization brought silence to the room. One investigator slammed a lid shut and stepped away, his hands trembling. The others stared, horrified, at what appeared to be machines built to spread chemicals rather than flames. Declassified U.S. Chemical Corps files from the late 1940s later confirmed that Japan had experimented with porcelain biological weapons.
Is Unit 731, an event filled with horror and human experimentation utterly beyond moral comprehension.
For the shaken investigators, the connection was terrifying. It was no longer just a line in an old file. They had seen the evidence with their own eyes. Some took it as proof, while others warned against drawing conclusions too quickly. But no one in that vault forgot what they had seen. The porcelain shells, the corroded canisters, and the strange prototypes stayed with them as reminders of weapons never meant to be found. Taken together, the artifacts reframed the vault. The collection suggested planning for the deliberate spread of disease and chemical contamination. For years, survivors had described sickness after strange drops. Many dismissed those memories as rumor, but the physical evidence gave their accounts new weight. Some investigators proposed these items were experimental prototypes from a larger program. Some believe mass production may have been intended but interrupted by the war's end. Other experts argue the finds could be isolated tests and not proof of broader plans. Skeptics stress that corroded fragments and partial devices cannot alone prove an organized campaign. The discovery elicited shock, anger, and deep unease. Weapons designed to spread invisible suffering stirred moral outrage among those who handled the material. The sense that human lives had been viewed as expendable fueled calls for thorough investigation. Even so, weapons alone could be one dark chapter. What they found next would send a chill down their spines. The treasure that wasn't gold. For decades, speculation about Japan's hidden wartime vaults captured imaginations across Asia. According to rumors, these sealed chambers were not simply military leftovers, but treasure houses filled with stolen bullion, diamonds, and the infamous Golden Lily plunder. Villagers spoke of wealth stripped from palaces and temples across China and Southeast Asia, hidden to fund Japan's return after defeat. Treasure hunters spent years hoping to uncover stacks of gold bars, ceremonial regalia, or priceless artifacts. When this vault was finally opened, many expected glittering fortune. What they found was something colder and far more unsettling. Among the first discoveries were bundles of ledgers wrapped in waxed cloth. The books were neat, carefully maintained, and dated. Yet the contents were disturbing in their vagueness. Instead of lists of bullion or inventories of artifacts, the pages recorded shipments under categories like specimens, often broken into subtypes such as Type A and Type B. There was no explanation of what these codes meant. Another recurring entry was medical stores, but the recorded amounts were far too large to be for normal hospitals or field units. Finally, the most cryptic category appeared repeatedly: special cargo. Instead of words, these entries were marked with symbols and shorthand that only insiders could have understood. The message was clear. Whatever this vault was built to preserve, it was not gold. The real treasure was information, research, and materials that those in power considered more valuable than food or currency. At a time when Japan was collapsing and its citizens were starving, gold could have been used to buy supplies or relief. Instead, the choice had been made to bury knowledge. That decision revealed priorities that valued scientific secrets over human survival. Not everyone accepts this interpretation. Some researchers suggest the vault could have been a decoy meant to mislead treasure hunters and shift attention from real wealth stored elsewhere. Others argue the vague language in the ledgers was coded reference to chemical or biological shipments. Skeptics counter that disappointed explorers may have exaggerated the mystery, and that a word like specimens might have referred to simple medical supplies rather than evidence of human experiments. What became undeniable, however, was that the records pointed investigators towards something darker than treasure: surgical tools that shouldn't be in a vault. The next layer of the vault revealed instruments that stopped the investigators cold. When the crates were opened, carefully wrapped in oiled cloth and sealed in wax paper, they found scalpels, bone saws, rib spreaders, and glass syringes. At first glance, the set looked like a surgical kit, but in that setting it became grotesque. Every tool showed clear signs of use. The edges were sharp, the steel uncorroded, as if someone had gone to great lengths to preserve them. The deliberate way they had been packed suggested not storage, but preparation, as if they were meant to be used again. Several researchers recoiled at the sight, some covering their mouths, others whispering that the room felt more like an operating theater than a vault. Beside the kits lay glass slides sealed with wax and labeled in neat handwriting. A few still contained tissue fragments that reacted under simple staining tests performed on site. Folded anatomical charts sat beside them, their notes written in a detached, clinical tone. One chart traced tissue breakdown from exposure to extreme cold. Another recorded respiratory collapse, with time intervals measured down to the minute. Reading the entries out loud left the room heavy with silence. They did not read like scientific observations. They read like experiments carried out on living subjects. Several members of the team exchanged horrified looks, while one refused to examine the charts any further. When the wrappings came off, the sound of metal striking metal echoed in the chamber. The lantern light reflected off the polished edges and threw harsh shadows across the walls. The effect unsettled everyone. The arrangement appeared intentional, almost staged. Some described it later as ceremonial, as if the instruments had been set aside with purpose, waiting for hands to pick them up again. That realization produced immediate anger and disgust. Workers who handled the crates dropped them back with shaking hands. The thought that these tools had been carefully preserved for continued use left the team nauseated. For several, the vault no longer felt like a storage site. It felt like they had stepped into the remains of a laboratory designed for cruelty.
When he overheard colleagues discussing a medical experiment in which they'd cut into the two girls whilst still alive, one Ukrainian and one Chinese.
Experts were summoned to examine the materials. According to reports, medical historians and forensic technicians noted similarities between these kits and instruments listed in wartime laboratory inventories linked to research in Manchuria. Some researchers believed the wax-sealed slides resembled samples referenced in declassified documents held in foreign archives. Investigators treated these comparisons as leads, while other experts urged caution and emphasized that resemblance is not conclusive and required laboratory proof. The combined presence of surgical instruments, labeled slides, and clinical charts suggested organized procedures carried out under controlled conditions rather than ordinary medical supply storage. Some investigators believe the materials point to systematic testing and methodical observation. Others caution that instruments and slides alone cannot determine intent and that contamination or misidentification after decades underground may complicate analysis. Skeptics insisted on rigorous testing before drawing definitive conclusions. The emotional weight of the find was immediate and heavy. Those who handled the discoveries reported feelings of shock, shame, and anger. Some survivors who had previously given testimony expressed relief that physical evidence had surfaced.
What goes on here is in reality far, far darker, forever stamped on history.
Public outrage rose quickly as news of the find spread. Investigators prepared to search deeper into the vault with professional caution and mounting moral urgency. The shadow of Unit 731. At the center of the mystery stood Japan's darkest wartime secret, Unit 731, a name tied to unimaginable cruelty. Officially called the Epidemic Prevention and Water Purification Department, it sounded like a program created to protect soldiers and civilians from disease. In reality, its purpose was entirely different. It was established under Dr. Shiro Ishii to develop biological weapons and to gather scientific data through experiments on human beings. The goal was not healing or prevention. It was to learn how to spread plague, cholera, anthrax, and other lethal agents, and to study in detail how the human body broke down under infection, injury, and extreme conditions. Mobile units carried out experiments across the region. Prisoners from occupied territories, including men, women, and children, were forced into these trials. The methods were brutal and are described in testimonies that remain hard to read. People were deliberately infected with plague, cholera, or anthrax, and then cut open alive so that researchers could track disease in real time. Others were tied outside in freezing weather until their limbs blackened, then dissected to study tissue death.
This experiment was insane, the frostbite testing.
Some captives were locked in pressure chambers until their eyes burst or forced to drink contaminated water to watch them weaken. Field tests released infected animals into villages or poisoned supplies to track how civilians collapsed. Survivors spoke of screams, despair, and the horror of being treated like test material. These were not acts of medicine, but steps toward weapons, leaving behind memories that still produce shock, anger, and grief. After Japan surrendered, accountability took a disturbing turn. American occupation officers questioned Unit 731 staff and collected materials. Declassified documents show that U.S. officials granted immunity or leniency in exchange for access to research data. Some internal reports described the information as highly valuable for post-war programs. That bargain left victims feeling betrayed and contributed to decades of silence. Some historians argue that not all research was surrendered. Reports suggest that parts of the work, including specimens, notes, or records, were hidden in Japan. Others dispute this claim and point out that Allied forces seized extensive archives in 1945. Critics warn that later discoveries could represent secondary materials rather than central collections. Silence endured because Cold War alliances discouraged exposure, and survivors who testified were often dismissed or ignored. That neglect deepened trauma and delayed justice. The vault's discovery now echoes those earlier suppressions. Some believe its contents could reveal evidence too sensitive to release. Others remain skeptical, yet when investigators opened the last chamber, denial ended. The chilling final chamber. Behind one last steel door sat the vault's heart. It had remained sealed for 80 years, untouched by any human hand. Investigators moved slowly as the welds were cut. For decades, there had been rumor, speculation, and outright denial. In this moment, all of it was about to be tested in the coldest possible way. Inside, rows of shelves came into view. On them stood glass containers filled with cloudy liquid. Within those jars were preserved biological samples. Some contained organs, others tissue fragments, and some even held entire rodents suspended in fluid. Each jar had a label, written in neat Japanese script, cataloging its contents. The investigators who handled them later admitted the sight was overwhelming. These were not random artifacts, but carefully preserved specimens, prepared with precision and intent. Beside the jars were stacks of logs. These were not military supply lists or financial ledgers. Instead, they detailed experiments in a language stripped of humanity. There were tables recording rates of plague infection, notes on how long subjects endured cold before collapse, and chilling observations about survival after exposure to different pathogens. There was no ambiguity about what the words described. These were records of deliberate suffering, written with clinical detachment. The chamber also contained wooden boxes. When opened, they revealed skeletal remains of animals used in experimentation. Skulls of dogs, monkeys, and other creatures were stored as if they were specimens in a laboratory. To the investigators, it was a grim confirmation of what survivors of Unit 731 had long claimed. Historians who reviewed these finds pointed out that they matched earlier discoveries in Harbin and in Tokyo. In those places, investigators had also uncovered animal skeletons packed in crates, alongside surgical tools, glass slides, and handwritten records of experiments. Some of the bones still carried clean cuts that showed deliberate dissection rather than decay. The repetition across sites left little doubt. This vault was not an isolated storehouse. It belonged to a broader system of concealment in which evidence of biological research was hidden away and preserved, only to resurface decades later. The greatest shock was the realization that what had been preserved here was never wealth. The true contents were a time capsule of Japan's darkest medical crimes. The Japanese military had not buried riches. They had buried shame, locking it behind steel and concrete as if hoping history would never dig it back up. Once news of the contents spread, historians began asking how far this secrecy had gone. Some argued that the vault was not an isolated effort, but part of a calculated attempt to erase evidence of Unit 731's work.
Is Unit 731 an event filled with horror and human experimentation utterly beyond?
They pointed to hints in military correspondence, suggesting orders to conceal research and specimens before the war's end. According to some reports, records hinted at multiple construction projects in the final years of the war that have never been fully explained. Skeptics, however, continued to question the validity of the find. Some suggested the discovery could have been staged, while others argued the evidence might have been exaggerated for effect. Yet as samples and photographs were compared to material already confirmed in China and Tokyo, outright denial became more difficult to sustain. The physical reality of the jars, the records, and the remains was hard to dispute. In the end, the chamber forced a grim realization. This was not myth. It was not the invention of conspiracy theorists or the exaggeration of survivors. It was a preserved archive of cruelty. And the most troubling question followed naturally. If one vault could conceal horrors of this scale, how many more remain buried beneath Japanese soil, waiting for someone to force their doors open?